Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about the important highlights from PwC's 2022 Annual Corporate Director Survey. And joining me again to review these highlights is Leah Malone, who's the Managing Director for PwC's Governance Insight Center. Welcome back, Leah.
Hi, thanks. Nice to be here.
So it's that time of the year when PwC publishes its results of its well-respected survey, the Corporate Director Survey. And every year I enjoy looking at the results. And this year, interestingly, there were several questions relating to sitting directors' attitudes towards ESG and its implementation into both company strategy and into culture. Now, what's interestingly is, from my sense, the question results said that there were still quite a few directors that sort of have not exactly bought into the concept yet. They are definitely behind the curve with respect to investors and employees and the SEC. And it seems to me that there's still a gap that needs to be worked on. So let's start it off. I'm curious on your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so let's unpack those ESG findings a little bit. When I think about, the questions that we asked from directors and what we heard from them in the survey around this topic, I kind of put it into three major themes. The first theme is that directors are clear that boards are discussing ESG much more than they ever did in the past. 55% of directors tell us that the topic of ESG is now regularly on the board's agenda. You and I know this. We talk to directors every day. Almost every single director you talk to is familiar with the topic of ESG, knows at least a little bit about it, and has talked about it in his or her own boardroom. So that's one piece. We also hear that directors feel they're very proficient in some of those areas that fall under that big ESG umbrella. Things like talent and culture, oversight of diversity and inclusion efforts, oversight of areas like data privacy and cybersecurity, some of those traditional areas of oversight that do kind of fall into the penumbra of ESG. Over 90% of directors tell us that their boards understand those issues very well and are very competent in them. So that's kind of one theme that I see. A second theme is that I do recognize a growing sense among directors that they're not really connecting ESG to the bottom line. So this came out in a couple of ways. Number one, we saw a decreasing percentage of directors who say that ESG impacts the company's financial performance. This went down to below half of directors who agree with that statement. We also saw a decreasing percentage of directors who say that ESG is linked to the company's strategy. That's a little bit alarming to me, because to your point about what investors and other stakeholders are looking for in the area of ESG, it's not just that boards are talking about it and that it's on the agenda. It's that boards and companies are really building it into the company's strategy and drawing those deeper connections. The third big thing that stood out to me in this area of ESG, and again, there's a lot to unpack here because it's such a big topic, but the third area is that perspectives and practices in this area vary wildly. So a couple of the ways that we took this apart in the survey: number one, the gender results. So what female directors say on these issues compared to what male directors say is quite different. Female directors are much more likely to say things like they make that connection between ESG and company strategy. Female directors are more likely to say that, for example, climate change should be a priority for management. So pretty big divergence in a bunch of different areas of responses. Another way that we saw this divergence of practices is between directors who serve on the boards of large companies, over 10 billion in revenue, and those who serve on the boards of small companies, so under $1 billion in revenue. Now, it's typically not the case when we look at responses from directors who serve on these large company boards versus smaller company boards. We usually don't see significant differences in many of the areas that we ask in the survey. ESG is one that stood out to me, though. So just to give you a couple of areas of perspective here. Directors who sit on large company boards were more than 3 times as likely to say that their boards had talked about climate change, that their boards had talked about things like carbon emissions, political stance from the company. They're also much more likely to say that ESG is a part of the risk calculation that the company is making, and that they're doing things like exploring ESG opportunities, as well as just, again, putting it on the agenda. So it's a complicated picture, and I agree with you that directors across the board probably are not where we might expect them to be at this point. But when you look a little bit deeper, what you see is that some boards are pretty far along and others are pretty far behind.
Well, again, you would imagine that with all that's circling around with the investor pressure and whatever, that boards would be a little further along, at this point. But we'll see. Every year, it's interesting to see how hopefully that gap is closing. So let me move on. One of the things that I always enjoy is that PwC always comes up with new sort of questions to ask. And there was one highlight, or probably in my opinion, a low light that stunned me the most. And that was the fact that almost 1/3 of board members don't want their CEO to serve on any outside boards. And I completely get limiting the amount of boards to 1 or maybe 2 at the most. But were you equally surprised at the fact that 1/3 want them to sit on no outside boards?
I was, yes, I did find that striking. So 31% of directors, when we asked how many other boards should your CEO be able to serve on, the answer was 0, as you mentioned. We also asked about board service for other named executive officers at the company. So, CFO, COO, should those folks be allowed to serve on outside boards? 40% of directors told us no again for those executive officers. And so what we really see is, I think, a much more bearish view from the director community writ large about that idea of sitting executives serving on outside boards. We also asked about how many boards they think independent directors should serve on. So, setting aside the executives who might be serving on outside boards, what about retired folks and others? And how many boards is the right number for, your regular given director? The most common answer that we heard from directors was that they felt 3 boards was the right number. Which again was a smaller number than we expected, given that many of the investors and proxy advisors are more at around 4 or 5 boards as being the upper limit. So what this says to me is that directors are a bit more conservative in terms of perhaps the amount of time that these folks have to devote to board service. So obviously for a sitting executive to sit on an outside board, it's a significant contribution of time to that other effort. I think they're a bit skeptical that the time and the bandwidth is there for those folks. But similarly, for the independent directors who are not active executives, this feeling that 4, 5, 6 boards just might be too many for many directors.
Yeah, and I probably couldn't disagree more with the directors that feel this way. I think it is part of a CEO or a CFO or somebody who's a trending CEO, part of their education, to sit on somebody else's board, sit on the other side of the table, and not only get the experience of what that company is doing with similar issues, but just to get the perspective of being a director and interacting with the CEO has to help everybody, and when they go back to their own company. So I can see limiting it to even to 1. I understand. I'm not sure it's a wise idea to say, hey, Mr. CEO, you can't serve on any outside board. So anyway, that was a question that sort of surprised me a little bit. So this survey is famous for the questions relating to, are there directors that should be replaced, probably is the question that always gets the most publicity, Leah, in any post-media kind of stuff. And this year, that number really hasn't changed. In fact, it hasn't changed probably in the last 3 years. I think it came in around 48% on directors, at least one director that should be replaced. But more interestingly, there were several questions relating to refreshment that suggest that boards aren't especially open to what I'll call other tools, like mandatory retirement, that might assist in sort of refreshing board skill sets. And we've seen that there isn't a ton of refreshment. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the questions relating to refreshment.
Yeah, it's a tough issue. And as you mentioned, we have seen a kind of a similar level of director discontent over the last couple of years in terms of when we ask how many directors on your own board should be replaced. As you mentioned, about 48% of directors said at least one fellow board member should go. 19% said 2 or more than 2 directors should be replaced from the board. And I think what is surprising about that number, yes, it largely mirrors the results for the last couple of years, but what's surprising is that it's not going down and that we're hearing it again and again, even with a really strong focus from investors, from regulators, from boards themselves on board refreshment. And this idea of digging into board composition and do we have the right folks around the table and the right skills represented, that year over year, there is this same sense of almost, half of boards have one or more directors who should probably give up their seat and let someone else come into that role. This isn't always because, the director, him or herself, is underperforming. Sometimes it just isn't the right fit or isn't fitting the needs of what the company and the board needs going forward. But this brings it around to this very difficult topic of how do you achieve that refreshment? So with all the focus from investors, with all the focus within boardrooms on this idea of board composition, how are we still here in the same place with relatively low turnover numbers and a fair amount of frustration, I think, from directors who think more could be done? So we did ask about whether directors think their boards would embrace some of these tools that are not used all that frequently. And what we found was 62% of directors said that their board does not have a mandatory retirement age and would not be willing to implement one. 70% said the same about term limits. They don't use them and the board doesn't want them. Well, that's fine. We know that these kind of rules-based approaches have some benefits. They do, I think, move this conversation about board refreshment forward. But what we know and what we hear all the time from boards and directors is that it's a blunt tool and it doesn't always achieve the result you want. Boards end up where they do have a retirement age or term limits. They find themselves asking directors to retire who are still major contributors to the board, and at the same time, not finding those tools helping them when there are directors who need to be kind of asked to move on from the role. So there is a reluctance to go to those blunt methods. One of the things that we did see in the survey that directors are fairly willing to embrace is the use of individual assessments. 35% of directors told us that their board doesn't use them now, but they think they'd be willing to adopt them. And that is one of those more individualistic tools. So it's not that rules-based approach of, you hit this age and you're off the board. It is another tool in the arsenal to help boards and board leadership deal with this question of refreshment. Do we have the right fit? Is every director on this board the right director going forward?
So it's become somewhat of a joke that the older I get, the more I think that older directors, can add value to this. But to your comment, there's a general theory that we don't need other tools because the board evaluation process should weed out, non-performers or people that don't have value going forward with the change of the business plan. But as we both know, most companies do the board evaluations, but this number of should their directors be replaced doesn't change. And the only thing that can come to mind, first of all, that's a huge red flag. I'm surprised investors aren't all over that. But there's a huge red flag for the directors themselves, in the sense that they don't appear to be able to have those tough discussions with directors. And it speaks to board leadership, and it actually gives board leadership, in my mind, a little bit of a black eye, that they aren't better at having those tough discussions. Is that the way you see it as well?
It's a very difficult topic for boards, and I think that there's a lot of room for improvement in this area. And you're absolutely right that it comes down to board leadership, because unless you have these, refreshment tools, the rules-based approaches that you're relying on, even if the board has a very robust individual assessment process, well, the result of that assessment is not a thumbs up or a thumbs down on each individual director. That's the board leadership receiving a compilation of comments from all of the directors on the board, as well as management, and then trying to weed through that and bring it to bear with some individual conversations with directors, trying to give feedback, coaching, trying to perhaps encourage directors that it might be their time to retire. These are very difficult conversations for board leadership to have, in part, I think, because boards have emphasized collegiality for so long. And it's almost, the nature of a board is that you're bringing together a group of peers. It's not a very hierarchical structure. And so bringing those kinds of conversations to bear and really having those tough talks about, is this the right fit for the board going forward? It's incredibly challenging for board leadership. And I agree with you that it is a bit of a black mark. And I think one that, a chair of a board should be thinking about pretty seriously, whether they're doing enough in that area.
And Leah, I understand the collegial part of this, and in the perfect world, that works. But in the end, it's a business. Okay. That seat is a very valuable piece of real estate that's critical to a company going forward. So, again, I'm a little surprised of all the things, that investors like to focus on. I'm a little surprised that they aren't zeroing in on this a little bit harder, to where they're making sure that the right people are in the room. So, we only scratched the surface. This year was especially interesting on some of the highlights and survey results. So where can people and viewers get a opportunity to get a copy of the whole survey results?
Yep, the entire report is available on our website. Lots more insights. As you said, TK, we barely scratched the surface. We cover many additional topics and areas. All of the full results of the survey are included in the report as well. So visit our website to find the full report.
Well, Leah, thank you as usual for the good recap. And we appreciate you taking the time to give us all the highlights. So thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week to take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.